The day began the way thousands of others had. Jabari Wells clocked in for his shift, took his assigned route, and pulled the city bus into motion, carrying people to work, to school, to appointments, to places that rarely make headlines. Public transit runs on routine, on predictability, on the quiet assumption that everyone will get where they are going and come home again. For Jabari, that assumption would not hold. Midway through the route, a confrontation unfolded over something small on paper, but heavy in consequence: an expired fare card. These disputes were not unusual. Drivers enforced rules they did not write, absorbing the frustration of riders already stretched thin by delays, overcrowding, and rising costs. What made this moment different was not immediately clear. There was no warning siren, no dramatic signal that this interaction would become something else entirely. Within minutes, the situation escalated beyond words. By the time first responders arrived, Jabari Wells was critically injured. Soon after, he was pronounced dead. A bus operator, killed while doing his job over a fare that amounted to only a few dollars. The city was left grappling with an uncomfortable question: how does a routine shift end like this? Early reports focused on the confrontation itself, the passenger involved, and the sequence of events on the bus. But almost as quickly, attention shifted outward. Co-workers spoke about fear they had carried for years. Riders described a transit system that felt perpetually on edge. Advocates questioned why operators were still expected to manage enforcement duties without adequate protection or support. Jabari's death did not occur in isolation. It happened inside a system already under strain, where frustration had become normalized and safety warnings were often treated as background noise. For many, this case forced a reckoning with what public-facing workers are asked to absorb in silence day after day. In the hours that followed, candles appeared near the route where Jabari had driven his final shift. Messages from fellow drivers described him as reliable, professional, and committed to his work. Riders who had never known his name now knew it for the worst possible reason. A routine shift had turned fatal, and the impact rippled far beyond the bus itself. This story is not just about a single act of violence. It is about the conditions that allow tension to build unnoticed, about systems that rely on resilience without reinforcing it, and about the human cost when those systems fail. To understand what happened to Jabari Wells, the story has to move backward and outward, beyond the moment of confrontation, into the world that shaped it. Cases like this often arrive in the public consciousness as brief alerts or breaking news banners, stripped down to the most immediate facts. A bus driver killed. A passenger detained. An investigation underway. What tends to get lost is the larger context, the slow accumulation of pressures that turn ordinary environments into volatile ones. That context is where this story truly begins. Public transportation is one of the few spaces where economic strain, policy decisions, and everyday human stress collide in real time. For millions of riders, buses are not a convenience but a necessity, linking paychecks to rent, medical care to survival. For operators, the job demands constant vigilance, emotional regulation, and enforcement of rules that often place them directly in the path of public frustration. Jabari Wells' death drew attention not just because of its violence, but because so many people recognized the conditions surrounding it. Drivers across the city acknowledged similar confrontations over fares and delays. Riders admitted to carrying anger that had little to do with the person behind the wheel. What happened on that bus felt less like an anomaly and more like a rupture along an already strained fault line. Here on Beyond the Evidence, The focus is on stories like this, cases where the surface narrative tells only part of the truth. If you value investigations that slow down, examine systems as well as individuals, and center facts over speculation, consider subscribing to the channel. Liking the video and turning on notifications helps ensure these stories continue to reach audiences who want more than headlines. This case demands that kind of attention. Not to assign blame prematurely, and not to sensationalize tragedy, but to understand how an everyday public service became the setting for a fatal encounter. The answers do not live solely in the final moments of Jabari's shift. They are embedded in policies, practices, and lived experiences that shaped that moment long before it occurred. Before examining the incident itself, it is necessary to understand who Jabari Wells was beyond the uniform, and how his role placed him at the intersection of competing pressures. Only then does the full weight of what was lost and what failed begin to come into focus. To most riders, a bus operator is a presence more than a person. Someone seen through a pane of glass, focused on the road ahead, responsible for keeping a tight schedule in a city where time is rarely generous. Jabari Wells lived inside that role for years, showing up day after day to do a job that required patience, precision, and a steady temperament. But beyond the uniform and the route number, he was a man with routines, responsibilities, and a sense of pride in his work. Those who knew Jabari described him as dependable. He was not the kind of employee who sought attention or special recognition. He worked his assigned routes, followed procedure, and took seriously the responsibility of moving people safely through the city. In a profession where burnout is common, his consistency stood out quietly rather than loudly. Jabari understood the realities of the job. He knew that riders often boarded his bus already frustrated by long waits, missed connections, or the strain of making ends meet. Co-workers later recalled that he tried to keep interactions calm, even when enforcing rules that put him in uncomfortable positions. Fare disputes, in particular, placed operators like Jabari in an impossible role, expected to uphold policy while absorbing the emotional fallout. Outside of work, Jabari was known as private. He did not seek to be defined by his job, even though it occupied a large part of his life. Friends and family spoke of someone grounded, practical, and focused on stability. Driving a bus was not just employment. It was a way to provide, to maintain structure, to be reliable in a world that often was not. That sense of responsibility extended to safety. Over time, Jabari became increasingly aware of how exposed operators were during confrontations. The bus offered little physical separation. Support was often delayed or unavailable. Like many drivers, he carried the weight of knowing that help might not arrive quickly if a situation escalated. Still, he showed up. Each shift meant navigating traffic, managing schedules, and responding to dozens of unpredictable interactions. The uniform made him visible, but it also made him a target for frustrations that had little to do with him personally. In that environment, professionalism became a form of self-protection. Understanding Jabari Wells as a person matters, because his death is sometimes reduced to a statistic or policy failure. He was neither abstract nor replaceable. He was a human being performing a public service, operating within a system that asked for resilience without always offering reinforcement in return. Before the incident that ended his life, Jabari was already navigating a web of relationships and tensions that shaped every shift. To see how those dynamics influenced what happened next, the story has to move outward, to the passengers, co-workers, and institutional structures that defined the space where he worked. Every bus route functions as a small, moving ecosystem. Operators, passengers, and supervisors rarely know one another well, yet they interact under conditions that demand instant cooperation. For drivers like Jabari Wells, each shift meant managing dozens of brief encounters, many of them shaped by stress long before anyone stepped onto the bus. Passengers arrived carrying the weight of their own circumstances. Missed connections, late arrivals, and unpredictable service had become routine for many riders. By the time they boarded, patience was often already depleted. The bus, rather than the policies behind it, became the most immediate place for that frustration to surface. Drivers occupied an uneasy middle ground. They were expected to enforce fair policies, maintain schedules, and de-escalate conflicts, often without backup. While supervisors existed in theory, they were rarely present in real time when disputes unfolded. Communication systems offered limited reassurance, especially during peak hours when multiple routes were strained simultaneously. Among operators, there was a shared understanding of this vulnerability. Conversations in break rooms and depots frequently turned to stories of near misses and tense confrontations. Some drivers adjusted by bending rules when possible. Others relied strictly on policy, believing consistency offered the only protection. Neither approach guaranteed safety. Jabari was known to follow procedure. Not rigidly, but carefully. That choice shaped his interactions on the route, particularly during fare disputes. Enforcing expired fare cards was never just about revenue. It was about compliance with expectations passed down from the transit authority, expectations that rarely accounted for the human cost of enforcement. The physical layout of the bus intensified these dynamics. Operators sat within arm's reach of passengers, separated by little more than a seat back or partial barrier. Voices carried easily. Tension had nowhere to dissipate. When disagreements arose, they unfolded in full view of everyone on board. Riders, for their part, often perceived drivers as representatives of a system that felt increasingly unreliable and unaffordable. Fare increases outpaced wage growth. Service interruptions became normalized. The bus driver became the most visible symbol of decisions made far above street level. This imbalance created a fragile social contract. Most days, it held. People boarded, paid, and moved on. But when it fractured, the consequences could be immediate and personal. Operators absorbed that risk with every stop, knowing that escalation could happen quickly and without warning. These daily interactions did not cause Jabari Wells' death, but they formed the environment in which it became possible. The route was not just a path through the city. It was a pressure point, shaped by policy, economics, and human stress. Understanding that environment is essential before examining the warnings that began to emerge long before the fatal encounter. Long before the day Jabari Wells lost his life, there were signs that the conditions on his route were becoming more dangerous. These were not sudden revelations uncovered only after the fact. They were documented concerns raised through internal channels and acknowledged without being meaningfully addressed. Records reviewed during the investigation showed that Jabari had reported multiple safety issues over the preceding months. Fare disputes were becoming more frequent and more aggressive. Riders, increasingly frustrated by service delays and rising costs, were less willing to accept enforcement decisions from operators. Each report followed the same pattern: an incident described, a concern noted, and no substantial change implemented. For drivers, the reporting process itself was a source of frustration. Complaints were logged into systems that offered little feedback beyond confirmation of receipt. Follow-up, when it came at all, often arrived in the form of generic guidance rather than concrete action. Additional security, route adjustments, or policy changes were rare. Jabari was not alone in raising alarms. Other operators described similar experiences, particularly on routes serving areas hardest hit by service reductions. The risks were widely understood among frontline workers, but that understanding did not translate into structural support. Over time, repeated inaction sent a clear message. Safety concerns were noted, but not prioritized. This lack of response had consequences. Drivers learned to adapt rather than escalate. Some avoided reporting altogether, believing it would change nothing. Others, like Jabari, continued to document incidents in hopes that persistence would eventually lead to intervention. The burden of managing risk remained squarely on the operator. Investigators later noted that none of the reported concerns triggered a comprehensive review of fair enforcement practices or operator protection. The responsibility to manage confrontations stayed with drivers, even as conditions worsened. The gap between policy and reality widened quietly. In hindsight, these reports read less like routine paperwork and more like warnings. Each entry reflected an environment where conflict was becoming normalized and safeguards were lagging behind. Yet at the time, they were absorbed into the background noise of a system under strain. By the time the fatal confrontation occurred, the warning signs were already there, scattered across internal logs and unaddressed communications. They did not predict a specific outcome, but they pointed to growing risk. The tragedy was not that the signs existed. It was that they failed to prompt action before escalation became irreversible. The story now moves to the moment when all of those unresolved tensions converged, transforming routine stress into irreversible loss. The day of the incident did not begin with crisis. Jabari Wells reported for work and took control of his bus under the same conditions he had navigated countless times before. Delays were already affecting the route, a familiar problem that placed immediate pressure on both operators and passengers. Each stop added another layer of tension to an already strained system. As the bus filled, the atmosphere shifted in small but noticeable ways. Riders expressed irritation over timing, missed connections, and the cost of fare. These frustrations were not directed at Jabari personally, but they moved through the confined space of the bus, amplifying with each interaction. For an operator, these moments required constant judgment, when to enforce policy, when to attempt de-escalation, and when to rely on procedure alone. The confrontation began over an expired fare card. According to investigative records, Jabari followed established protocol, informing the passenger that the fare was not valid. Fare enforcement placed him in a position of authority without protection, responsible for upholding a rule while absorbing the emotional response to it. What might have been a brief disagreement escalated as the passenger refused to comply. Witness accounts later described raised voices and visible agitation. The bus, with nowhere to divert tension, became the setting for a rapidly deteriorating situation. Jabari remained at his post, attempting to manage the interaction while maintaining control of the vehicle and the safety of other riders. There was no immediate assistance available, and no practical way to remove himself from the confrontation. The escalation unfolded quickly. Within moments, the dispute turned physical. Investigators would later confirm that the violence occurred before meaningful intervention was possible. By the time emergency services were alerted, Jabari had sustained critical injuries. The bus came to a stop, its route interrupted in the most final way. Passengers were forced to confront the reality of what had just occurred, not as observers of a distant event, but as witnesses to a breakdown happening in real time. The space that had carried people through their daily routines became a scene of shock and disbelief. Jabari was transported to the hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. News of his death spread rapidly, reframing the incident from a fair dispute to a fatal workplace tragedy. A routine enforcement action, performed countless times by operators across the city, had ended in irreversible loss. The significance of that day extends beyond its immediate facts. It marked the point where accumulated stress, unaddressed warnings, and systemic vulnerabilities converged. What broke was not just a moment of order on a bus route, but the assumption that frontline workers could continue absorbing risk without consequence. As the city began to process what had happened, attention shifted to the aftermath. How individuals, institutions, and the public responded to a death that many felt should never have occurred. In the hours following Jabari Wells' death, the transit system continued to move, but it did so under a heavy, unsettled silence. News spread quickly among drivers, many of whom learned what had happened while still on shift. Routes were completed with distraction and unease, as operators confronted the reality that one of their own had been killed doing the same job they were still expected to perform. For Jabari's family, the loss arrived suddenly and without preparation. A routine workday had turned into a permanent absence. Public statements released on their behalf focused on grief rather than anger, describing a man who had gone to work and never returned. The shock was compounded by the knowledge that his concerns about safety had not been met with action. Within the transit community, the response was immediate. Drivers organized vigils at depots and along the route Jabari had driven that day. Candles, handwritten notes, and flowers appeared near bus stops, marking spaces that were otherwise designed to be temporary and anonymous. These gatherings were quiet, reflective, and heavy with shared fear. Riders responded in their own way. Social media filled with messages expressing sorrow, disbelief, and recognition. Many admitted they had never considered the risks operators faced until this moment. Others spoke openly about their own frustrations with the system, acknowledging how easily tension could spill onto the person behind the wheel. Public officials issued condolences and promises of review. Statements emphasized sympathy and commitment to safety, but for many, they echoed language heard after previous incidents. The words were familiar. The skepticism was too. Drivers questioned whether anything would truly change once public attention faded. Media coverage began to widen its focus. Initial reports centered on the suspect and the mechanics of the crime. Within days, that narrative expanded to include labor concerns, fair enforcement policies, and long-standing complaints from transit workers. Jabari's death became a symbol of broader instability rather than an isolated act of violence. For a brief moment, the city collectively paused. Conversations about public transportation shifted from inconvenience to consequence. The question was no longer just what happened on that bus, but how many similar risks were embedded in everyday operations across the system. As mourning gave way to scrutiny, the focus turned toward accountability. Investigators and journalists began to look beyond the immediate aftermath, asking what systemic failures had allowed this tragedy to unfold, and what the official investigation would ultimately reveal. As the criminal investigation moved forward, detectives focused first on establishing a clear sequence of events. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and transit records were reviewed to reconstruct what happened on the bus. This process was methodical and narrow by necessity, centered on individual actions and legal responsibility. But alongside it, a broader inquiry began to take shape. Journalists and oversight bodies started examining internal transit authority documents, many of which revealed patterns that extended well beyond this single case. Reports from drivers across multiple routes described similar fare-related confrontations, increasing hostility from riders, and a lack of timely support. Jabari Wells' prior safety complaints were no longer isolated entries. They fit into a much larger record of unresolved concerns. Economic context became impossible to ignore. Fare increases had outpaced wage growth for years, placing additional strain on riders who relied on public transportation the most. At the same time, service reliability had declined, with delays and cancellations becoming routine. The bus, already a site of daily stress, had become a flashpoint for systemic frustration. Experts in public transportation and labor safety weighed in, noting that operators were being asked to perform enforcement duties without adequate protection or training. Many systems, they explained, had already begun shifting fare enforcement away from drivers to reduce conflict. In this city, that transition had been discussed but never fully implemented. Investigators also reviewed response protocols. Communications between operators and dispatch revealed gaps in real-time assistance. When conflicts escalated, drivers were often left to manage alone until help could arrive, if it arrived at all. These delays were not anomalies, they were structural limitations baked into understaffed operations. The picture that emerged was not one of sudden failure, but of gradual erosion. Decisions made to cut costs or maintain schedules had compounded over time, increasing risk at the street level. Jabari's death exposed the human consequences of those decisions in the most direct way possible. What began as a homicide investigation had evolved into a case study of public infrastructure under strain. Responsibility extended beyond one individual act to a network of policies, priorities, and omissions. The revelations forced officials to confront uncomfortable questions about how safety was defined and who was expected to absorb the consequences when systems failed. As evidence accumulated, public pressure intensified. Calls for reform grew louder, and the transit authority faced demands not just for answers, but for accountability. The next phase of the story would test whether those demands would lead to meaningful change, or fade once the spotlight moved on. As the findings of the investigation became public, pressure mounted on the transit authority to respond in concrete terms. What had once been framed as an isolated tragedy was now widely understood as a result of compounding operational failures. The question facing officials was no longer whether change was needed, but how much responsibility they were willing to accept. Initial responses followed a familiar pattern. Leadership issued statements expressing sorrow for Jabari Wells' death and reaffirming a commitment to employee safety. Task forces were announced. Internal reviews were promised. For many drivers, these gestures felt procedural rather than transformative, echoing past responses to non-fatal incidents that had resulted in little lasting reform. Under sustained scrutiny, the authority released portions of its internal safety records. These documents confirmed that Jabari's complaints were not unique and that fare-related conflicts had been increasing system-wide. Critics pointed to the gap between data collection and action, arguing that acknowledging risk without mitigating it amounted to institutional neglect. Labor unions intensified their advocacy, demanding changes that operators had requested for years. Proposals included removing fare enforcement responsibilities from drivers, increasing en route security presence, and improving real-time support systems. Some measures were approved on a limited basis, often framed as pilot programs rather than permanent solutions. Public hearings provided a rare forum for operators to speak directly to decision-makers. Testimony described a culture where safety concerns were logged but deprioritized, and where frontline workers were expected to compensate for systemic shortcomings through personal resilience. Jabari's name was invoked repeatedly, not as a symbol, but as evidence of what happens when warnings go unanswered. The Transit Authority faced difficult constraints, budget limitations, staffing shortages, and political oversight, but those realities did little to ease public frustration. Riders and workers alike questioned why financial pressures consistently outweighed safety considerations. The cost of inaction had now been measured in a human life. While some policy adjustments were implemented, critics noted their incremental nature. Training modules were updated. Communication protocols were revised. Yet the underlying structure that placed drivers in confrontational roles remained largely intact. Accountability, many argued, was being managed rather than fully embraced. Jabari Wells' death forced the Transit Authority into a reckoning it had long avoided. Whether that reckoning would result in lasting reform or temporary compliance remained uncertain. What was clear was that the system could no longer claim ignorance. The failures had been documented, exposed, and tied irrevocably to loss. As institutional responses unfolded, the story turned toward reflection. What this case revealed about public infrastructure, shared responsibility, and the unseen risks borne by those who keep cities moving. Jabari Wells' death cannot be understood solely as a moment of violence on a city bus. It stands as a reflection of how fragile public systems become when strain is treated as normal and warning signs are absorbed rather than addressed. His life ended in a space designed for movement and connection, yet shaped by policies and pressures that had been building quietly for years. Public transportation is often discussed in terms of efficiency and cost. Schedules, budgets, and ridership numbers dominate the conversation, while the human element fades into the background. Jabari's story forces that element back into focus. It asks what happens when frontline workers are asked to enforce rules without protection, to manage conflict without authority, and to absorb frustration without relief. The case also challenges assumptions about responsibility. Riders, operators, administrators, and policymakers all occupy different positions within the same system. When that system fails, the consequences do not fall evenly. They land most heavily on those with the least power to change the conditions they work within. In the aftermath, incremental reforms may reduce risk, but they do not erase the reality that this death was preventable. The warning signs were present. The concerns were documented. The cost of ignoring them became devastatingly clear. Jabari Wells did not die because public transportation exists. He died because its failures were allowed to persist without meaningful correction. Remembering him means resisting the tendency to move on once attention fades. It means questioning how many other workers operate under similar conditions, and how many incidents remain narrowly avoided rather than prevented. Systems reveal their priorities not through statements, but through what they choose to fix, and what they leave unchanged. For viewers, this story invites reflection rather than outrage. How should cities balance enforcement, safety, and accessibility? Who bears the risk when infrastructure frays? And what responsibility does the public share in recognizing the humanity of those who keep essential services running every day? Jabari Wells' name now exists beyond the route he drove. It exists as a reminder that routine does not mean safe, and that silence around systemic strain carries consequences. The hope is that understanding his story does more than inform. It prompts attention before the next warning goes unheard.